Do you worry about that one juror, that one thing that you could have said, the one witness you could have brought up, the one thing? Does that haunt you when you're trying a case?
I'm going to tell you the stuff that I worry about. Hold on 1 second.
Sure.
You can mute this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can cut this out later.
Yeah, I can cut it out later. Yeah, sure.
The evidence is overwhelming. I mean,
Okay.
The evidence is just, it's overwhelming.
True.
No, what that means is, did you love your wife? Yes, I did. I loved her so much. Did you kill your wife? No. Nope. No further questions.
I am happy to speak to you again. I can do it on Zoom when I'm walking my dogs.
Okay.
I'll call you back. I do it every day. It doesn't matter, we'll eventually,
Great.
and so you hear that right now?
It's going to be a series. If the first part of the documentary, The Jinx, about the life of millionaire real estate heir Robert Durst, answered the question, did Robert Durst murder his wife, Kathy McCormick Durst, his best friend, Susan Berman, and his neighbor, Morris Black, the sequel answered the questions, why Durst did it, and how the state of California, led by Deputy DA John Lewin, proved Durst, quote, killed them all, of course, unquote, as he famously admitted in a hot mic moment in the finale of the first season. Durst's 2021 trial was a match of the eccentric murderer millionaire versus the iconoclastic prosecutor, and it was nothing short of fascinating, showcasing John Lewin's amazing ability to examine and cross-examine witnesses. Lawyers are taught to only ask questions they know the answer to, and told the answers are unimportant, a practice Mr. Lewin calls arrogant. John Lewin prefers to ask questions, quote, of which there are no good answers, unquote, like this exchange.
Would you lie under oath to help your case?
Yes.
Okay. Have you lied thus far during your testimony at this trial?
No.
But if you had lied, given your last answer, you might not admit it, correct?
Correct. Because what I'm saying is mostly the truth. There are certain things that I would lie about, certain very important things.
So maybe another way to say it, Mr. Durst, is would you agree that the question of did you kill Susan Berman is the most important question in this trial?
I would agree with that.
And you've also just agreed that you would lie about that.
Correct.
And you also just agreed that, in fact, if you had killed her, you wouldn't tell us, correct?
Correct.
I never had more fun or learned more than I did interviewing Mr. Lewin over a series of weeks as he walked his dogs, 2 Great Danes and a Basset Hound, through the hills of Los Angeles. Thanks to Murder by Maestro's audio engineering expertise, these interviews are now finally broadcast worthy. It's my pleasure to share them with you. Take a listen. So this was a really nice surprise, D.A. Lewin. So what were the challenges in trying someone like Durst, Robert Durst?
Well, I would say that the challenge in that case was not the evidence. The evidence was overwhelming. It's probably the most overwhelming amount of evidence that I've had in any of the cold murder cases that I've tried. So I think the challenges were that, number one, there was so much publicity that We didn't know how it was going to affect the jury pool. And then there were also issues that went back to how jurors might end up being influenced by monetary considerations. So the big issue that we had was figuring out how we can make sure that we get jurors who are going to be looking at the evidence in the case rather than trying to figure out how they can monetize their service. And we were very confident that if we had jurors who looked at the evidence in the case, it was a slam dunk. It was overwhelming.
And did the Jinx have anything to do with your prosecution of Durst?
Oh, absolutely. So originally, let me give you a little bit of background on kind of my history. I joined the DA's office in 1994. And since 1997, I have, for the most part, been doing complex, circumstantial, almost exclusively cold murder cases. And in 2004, I was transferred to what's called our Major Crimes Division, where I'm still a member of that unit today. Somewhere around 2006 or so, a detective that I knew from LAPD's Robbery Homicide Division approached me about this case and asked me to look at it. At the time, my boss, who's since retired, told me, absolutely, you can't do it. We've already looked at it. There are a number of problems with it, and I don't want you looking at it. And that was one of those rare times where I actually listened to my chain of command. It did what I was supposed to. I didn't look at it. He had our assistant head deputy at the time, a guy named John Monahan, who's a phenomenal lawyer. Monahan had looked at it, said it wasn't there, and that was good enough for me. So fast forward, when Jarecki and Smerling ended up doing the interview with Sarah Kaufman in 2011 and got what's commonly known as the Sarah letter, they realized what they had. And in 2012, when they did the second interview with Durst, the first interview was over 3 days in 2010, December 11th, 12th, and 13th. So in between those first interviews, in 2011, they got the Sarah note, and then they were trying to do a second interview with Durst, and there kept being reasons why he wouldn't do it. Finally, on April 18, 2012, they did that interview, and that's some of the footage that we've all seen where Durst is confronted with the Sarah note. So after they ended up getting that really incriminating evidence, they tried to figure out what they could do with it and how they could get law enforcement involved. So they ended up utilizing an ex-DA, Marcia Clark, who I didn't know, but who had tried OJ. Marcia had a detective that she had known from those times, who I was very close to, and she ended up apparently telling Jarecki that I was a person to contact. Completely separately from that, I was contacted by the FBI and LAPD because the FBI had become involved based on the threat assessment report from Douglas Durst, and an investigator named Eric Perry was looking to see what case could be put together against Bob Durst. He realized that the Kathy Durst situation had never gone anywhere, that the Morris Black case had already been tried. So I, in essence, got contacted within a couple of weeks apart from two different ends on this case. Once I got contacted, this is years after I'd originally been approached by RHD, my boss had retired, and now there was new evidence, meaning the interviews with Jarecki and Smerling. Without those interviews, we wouldn't have had a case.
There is a very contentious hearing before the trial. it looks like they came up with a new defense where they were going to say that he admitted to writing the cadaver note. Am I remembering correctly? I'm doing this off the seat of my pants.
So here's what happened.
Thank you.
So what happened is that, so very early on, I started working on this case in January of 2013. We ended up filing the case in March of 2015. Durst did not get out here for arraignment until November of 2016. So his lawyers were on the case once we filed it, but technically he had not been arraigned yet. They didn't have any discovery. They didn't know what he had said to me during the New Orleans interview. And a big decision they had to make very early on, they had two choices. One choice is Bob Durst did not write the cadaver note, was never in Los Angeles, etc. Option two is Bob Durst wrote the cadaver note, and obviously if he wrote the cadaver note, that means he found Susan's body. That means he's going to have to testify to explain it. Now, one of their big problems the defense had was they didn't know what Bob Durst had told me during the March 15th, 2015 interview. So they were kind of flying blind. And that is why when DeGuerin would be on TV, he would go on TV, but he would never indicate, he would be asked whether Bob had written the cadaver note or not, and he would never say. So the issue that they had was to figure out what their defense was going to be. So the first thing they tried to do was they tried to attack the handwriting. So I think the first thought was going to be, we're going to get the handwriting testimony kept out of court. If we get the handwriting testimony kept out of court, they can't say Bob Durst wrote it. And so presumably our defense will be Bob didn't write it. Now, what they didn't seem to understand is that under the evidence code in California, handwriting is the only area, literally in all of forensics in California, where there's an evidence code that literally says the juror can be their own expert. They can actually do the handwriting comparisons on their own. There's a second handwriting evidence code section that says that a handwriting expert can testify. So we got the best handwriting experts in the world, and they came back with the conclusive opinion that Bob Durst absolutely wrote the cadaver note. And what the defense tried to do is, instead of hiring handwriting experts to counter it, they hired a couple of lawyers who testify throughout the country for money regarding the lack of reliability of handwriting evidence. Well, they try to rely on a Wisconsin case, which is not appropriate authority in California. And we litigated the handwriting for several years, and they lost at every opportunity. So very early on, the other thing that we tried to do was we tried to present and to discover evidence that Bob was in California at the time of the murder. So the key moment in the case was Bob had very long-standing friends, Stuart and Emily Altman. He had gone to high school with Stuart. Stuart had become a criminal lawyer and had married Emily. They were very close personal friends. Stuart at times actually did operate as Bob's lawyer. So we tried to contact Stuart and Emily. We did not try to contact them until Bob was in custody. The majority of the witnesses that we interviewed in this case, that took place between the time Bob was arrested in March of 2015 and November of 2016 when he was arraigned. And the reason for that was that prior to that point, had we contacted these witnesses and had Bob found out about it, our concern was he was going to flee to Cuba and we'd lose him. So we were in kind of a catch-22 between 2013 and 2015. We needed to interview witnesses to put our case together. But if we interview these witnesses and he finds out about it, he's going to flee. So once we filed the case and Bob was in custody, now we were able to interview him, and we got extremely lucky that Bob brought a bunch of marijuana and a gun as a felon to about the worst state where you could be a felon in possession of a firearm and a lot of drugs, and that's Louisiana. So that tied him up for a long period of time, which allowed us to put our case together. So prior to Bob being arrested, we did not contact Stuart and Emily Altman. Reason's pretty simple. We knew if we contacted them, Bob was going to know about it. And I knew that Bob had no worries about Morris Black because he'd already been acquitted. I also knew that Bob had no worries about Kathy because Westchester had basically never done anything about it. During the original investigation, Manhattan had never done anything. And when the reinvestigation happened in 1999 and 2000, they also didn't do anything. So I think Bob's position was, I'm not worried about them. The concern was that he knew that the Susan Berman case was a big potential problem for him. And the last thing that we wanted was for him to know that Los Angeles authorities were working on the case. So once he was charged, now he's in custody, he can't go anywhere. Now we reached out to Stuart and Emily Altman. And from the start, they were extremely uncooperative. They wouldn't speak to us. And I realized that they were incredibly important because it became very apparent that Bob Durst was hiring lawyers for them, trying to keep them out of our case. And I also knew that Bob's lawyers were making a lot of efforts to contact Stuart and Emily. And so it became clear to my team and I that they're not doing this for nothing. Stuart and Emily must have important information. Stuart originally tried to claim that his conversations with Bob were all protected by attorney-client privilege. Even to the point of Stuart was going to refuse to answer questions about his historic relationship with Bob going back to high school, which obviously cannot involve attorney-client privilege because he wasn't a lawyer. So Emily was a different story. Originally, she just refused to speak to us, which is her right. We then realized that she had a bunch of information and we wanted to get her on the witness stand. So we ended up subpoenaing her and Stuart for conditional examinations. And we were also able to review all of Emily's calls with Bob that took place in the New Orleans jail because they were not covered by privilege because under Louisiana law, they are told when they call that the calls are being recorded, and there are special arrangements you can make if you're talking to your lawyer, which they didn't make. So when you listen to all the Louisiana calls involving Emily and Bob, none of them pertain to any legal issues. They were just friendship calls. So we were very confident that if we got Emily on the stand, that Emily had information that she had not conveyed. We tried to figure out what that information might be. We never believed that Bob had confessed to Emily. That's just not Bob. Bob's not going to admit to a close friend of his that he committed murder when he doesn't have to. But knowing Bob and how disorganized, sloppy, and arrogant he is, or was, we believe that very likely what he had said to Emily was something more to the effect of he was in Los Angeles at the time of the killing, which he had always denied to everybody. So the key moment in the entire prosecution was when Emily Altman was testifying at conditional examination. And we knew that Emily had spoken to both Jarecki and Smerling, to Andrew Jarecki, and Smerling, as well as to Charlie Bagley from the New York Times. So when I had Emily on the stand, I asked her about both conversations with they're reporters because Jarecki and Smyrna are considered reporters. And the way that I asked the question was, I asked her, and I'm going back to my memory, isn't it true that you told Charlie Bagley that Bob Durst told you he was in Los Angeles at the time of the murder? And her answer was no. And then I asked her the same thing about Andrew Jarecki, and her answer was, I don't know, or I don't remember. What that told me is she basically just admitted that Bob Durst had said that to her. She just didn't remember if she had repeated it to Jarecki. That was incredibly important, because if Bob had never told her that, the answer would have been not I don't know or I don't remember. It would have simply been no, it did not happen. So in real time, she answered that. I realized that I had her. I pushed her, and that's when she ended up making the admission during the conditional examination of, Bob told me he was in Los Angeles at the time of the murder, and she said he told her that he was staying at the Beverly Hilton. So once we got that, it was devastating. It was probably the most devastating event that happened during the entire pendency to prosecution. DeGuerin literally looked like he was going to pass out and made a comment to the effect of, that was very damaging. He then, in one of the more baffling things I've seen in my 30-year career as a prosecutor, got up on cross-examination, and he asked her the following leading question. Isn't it true that you didn't hear that Bob Durst was in Los Angeles at the time of Susan's murder from Bob Durst, that you heard it instead from your husband, Bob's lawyer? Are you still following me?
Yes.
Okay. That was an incredible question. Because basically what the defense did was they were intentionally asking about privileged information. And because it was a leading question, what they were expecting her to say, which is what she said, is yes, that's what happened. Now, what's baffling is obviously that wasn't true, but it's as if the defense thought that if they asked the question and she said, no, I heard it from my husband's lawyer, that question is asking for a privileged statement. So in other words, if Bob Durst had said that to his lawyer, Stuart Altman would, under attorney-client privilege, not be allowed to repeat it to anybody, including his wife. It would be privileged. If he had repeated that statement, it's improper and I wouldn't be able to use it. But you had the defense asking Emily Altman about it. So this wasn't like she blurted it out. It's a leading question. They're asking the question for her to say, yes, I think I heard it from my husband, Bob's lawyer. Now, the crazy part of that is that even if she's going to say, yes, I heard it from Stuart and not from Bob, that doesn't erase her prior answer where she said she heard it from Bob. So we were absolutely shocked. It's probably the most shocking moment I've ever had as a lawyer. Never had anything like this. So basically, once that happened, the defense was in the position where they probably were going to have to admit that Bob was in Los Angeles at the time of the murder, and therefore now they're going to have to admit that he wrote the cadaver note. So back to your original question. So this happened a couple of years before the trial, and I don't know if you remember, but there are approximately 80 stipulations that the defense agreed to in the case. Have you ever seen those stipulations?
No, I haven't.
So one stipulation would be that, Bob Durst authored the cadaver note. Another stipulation was the defense agreed that the video and audio of the Bob's interviews was unedited. So all their talk about how the Jinx was edited, it didn't matter because the jury heard the Jinx. They heard the unedited footage, and the lawyer stipulated that it was unedited. The lawyer stipulated that we could use the conditional examination testimony instead of recalling witnesses. There are something like 80 stipulations, which we ended up getting from the defense. They didn't have to agree to those stipulations. We pushed it and they agreed. So we are now in late 2019. We are 2 weeks away from starting the jury selection in the case. We had litigated all of the handwriting issues multiple times. We're now about to start trial. The judges ruled our way on everything. All the handwriting evidence is coming in. And the defense has still not hired a handwriting expert to dispute our experts. So I tell them, listen, here's the situation. You have till the end of the week to stipulate that Bob wrote the cadaver note. If you don't, I'm not going to agree to stipulate, and I'm going to put on 2 or 3 weeks of handwriting experts. And in the end, you're not going to have any idea how to cross-examine them, and you're not going to have any expert to call in response, and you're going to look really stupid. So finally, on I think December 22nd of 2019, literally 2 weeks before we started jury selection, they stipulated that Bob wrote the cadaver note. As soon as they did that, that meant they were stipulating, in essence, that Bob found the body. Obviously, he can't write the cadaver note if he didn't find the body, and that also that he was going to have to testify. So that all goes back to Emily Altman. That was the key in the case. Without Emily Altman, they wouldn't have had to stipulate that Bob wrote the cadaver note, and Bob wouldn't have had to testify. Now, would Bob have testified anyway? Probably, because that's what he likes to do.
You said that's not like Durst. That's not something Durst would do. You said also Emily Altman wouldn't, you wouldn't confess to Emily Altman.
What I mean by that is that Bob Durst doesn't confess to anybody. So as an example, I am 100% certain that Bob Durst never said to Susan Berman, hey, listen, I murdered Kathy and I need you to help me get rid of the body, and, or give me a false alibi. What he said to Susan would have been something like, Kathy and I had a fight and she accidentally died. Now, I don't think that's what happened. I think that Bob killed her. Whether it was murder or manslaughter, we'll never know. I'm pretty confident that Bob didn't get up that day, decide to kill Kathy. They got into an argument. Bob's got a bad temper, and as evidenced by the Peter Schwartz stuff, he killed her. So I knew that there's no way he's going to have told Emily Altman, I murdered Susan Berman. Yeah, he doesn't have any reason to do it. The only actual confession that he ever made in the case, other than in court when he slipped up, the only intentional confession he ever made was to Nick Chavez about Susan. And I believe that the reason that he said that to Nick is he wanted Nick to understand. And the words he used are very important. It was her or me. I had no choice. He wanted Nick to understand that he killed Susan out of a sense of self-survival. By the way, I think that's absolutely accurate. Bob didn't kill Susan because he didn't want to pay her money. The problem for Bob Durst is that he killed Susan about 20 years too late. She'd already told the story to 10 different people.
What makes you so exciting to watch as a true crime observer is you're so psychological. You seem to have gotten Durst, and I think it's something Nick Chavez said was that I feel like you're inside my brain and you're reading my thoughts, something like that.
I thought it was because I was so handsome.
Well, have you always had that kind of personality, or is there something about your personality that's particularly psychological? Have you always been able to obsess people pretty well? And how do you do that?
Well, so listen, that's a very interesting question, and it's one of the reasons. Okay, so we have to take it's not a short answer, but I'm going to try to answer it as best I can. So, if you see me inside or outside the courtroom, I am literally the same person inside the courtroom as I am outside the courtroom. If you talk to me right now, I don't have like a personality in court and a personality outside of court. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So what does that mean? Well, that means that kind of what you see is what you get. So I've always had an interest. I like people, and I think I'm a sincere and genuine person. If you listen to the conversations with Nick Chavez, from the very first time I called Nick, and I want to be fair to Nick for a second, the first call that we made to him was that April 2015. And when we called him, I'd been trying to get a hold of him since Bob was in custody. So obviously, there was no way that I was going to interview Bob Durst. There was no way I was going to interview Nick Chavez while Bob Durst was not in custody. Because if you think about it, Roberta, if I would have interviewed Nick, the first thing that's going to happen is Nick is going to tell Bob Durst, and we're never going to see Bob again. So I had to wait to interview Nick until Bob was actually in custody. So as soon as Bob was in custody, I start trying to contact Nick. Nick won't return any calls. I had to basically call his boss at the advertising agency where he worked, and his boss told him, "Hey, you got to call these guys back. They won't leave us alone." So Nick ends up calling us back. And Nick's a very smart guy. And what Nick said was, from the start, Nick really, in that first conversation, he did not say, Bob didn't tell me anything. What he said is, I don't want to tell you. Do you remember that or no, Roberta?
Yes, I do. I do remember that.
I knew from that first conversation that very likely Bob had either confessed to Kathy or to Susan or to both. And I knew that it was very hard for Nick. I also knew that it was going to take time. And I told Nick from day one, listen, Nick, my goal is that eventually you're going to tell me what you know. And it might be our first conversation. It might be, our 10th conversation. But I don't think you will go into court and perjure yourself. So I'm just hoping that before we get to court, you will tell me what actually happened. And it was a long process. And I would say to Nick, Nick, you got to rip the Band-Aid off. So Nick understood that we knew what he knew. And I think he was appreciative that, we were upfront with him. So going back to your question, I love, and I've always found it fascinating to figure out how can I get people to tell me information they have when they don't necessarily want to do it. I also know that I'm taping every single conversation that I'm having, and that eventually that's going to end up in front of a jury. So I know when I'm talking to Nick that the jury is going to be listening to this. And I want the jury to understand that I'm a fair, reasonable, decent person. I don't get to sit there and tell the jury, hey, listen, I'm a good guy. You should trust me. But when they're listening to these interviews, I know that's going to happen. For the same reason, when I'm taping Doug Oliver, I know all that stuff's going to get played in court eventually.
Oh, let's get into Doug Oliver. Actually, this was like some of the most incredible witnesses in the Durst trial. They were just verboten to Durst, and they'd come in, they deny saying something, and then you'd say, play 5, exhibit 518. And their statement that they just denied 1 second ago would be, I guess we were also stupefied by the fact that they didn't know that you didn't have the evidence, that you weren't asking questions that you didn't know the answer to. Do you think that, oh boy, were you prepared for the kind of loyalty to Durst that these characters had?
Well, I was hoping. So if we take them one at if we take them one at a time, Doug Oliver.
Who was Doug Oliver? He looks like the devil, really.
Well, Doug Oliver is a very wealthy guy.
How did he get so wealthy?
Well, he got wealthy because he married the daughter of Abe Hirschberg, who was at one time a billionaire in New York City.
Sure.
He married his daughter, and ended up becoming kind of a real estate developer as well. Never to the level of the Durst organization, and he and Bob became close friends. Now, I knew the relevance of Doug Oliver was that Doug Oliver had not been interviewed during the original investigation, but during the subsequent investigation, Doug Oliver was interviewed, and Doug told Joe Becerra from the New York State Police that he believed that Kathy had been abducted into white slavery. Okay. Now, obviously, he doesn't believe that. He was very hostile during that, and he's very hostile during any interview. He was an incredibly arrogant individual, probably in my career, the most obnoxious witness I've ever dealt with, the worst. And he came off that way. So there was discussion that they were going to call him as a character witness, which I would have loved. I wanted to get him on the stand as early as possible in my case. So I called him as my own witness. Now, one of the things that I like to do, and there was a lot of criticism by these commentators who don't know anything. I am definitely an expert in the California Evidence Code. So I know it backwards and forwards. That's been something my entire career that I have made sure of. And generally speaking, when I go into a courtroom, I know the evidence code better than anyone else in that courtroom. And that's going to, with one exception I can think of, that's going to be the judge as well. So I know the evidence code very well. In California, let me back up. Traditionally, there are certain things that you do as a lawyer. So one of those things is that the standard way that you handle a lying witness is you ask the witness about their testimony, whatever it might be. Then you impeach their testimony with whatever you have. Then you end up impeaching them kind of in general. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, that's not my approach. What I like to do is I have discovered in my career that if I gut a witness on issues of credibility before I even get to what they're testifying to in the case, then they're done. By the time they give any statements about the actual evidence in the case, the jury is so disgusted with them, they have zero credibility. Traditionally, that's what I do with experts. So with Doug Oliver, what I started with was his absolute hostility towards being contacted. And this is a man who, we called him up, and I know I'm taping. He doesn't know I'm taping, and I know in advance I'm going to be playing this in front of a jury likely. So, I'm going to give this guy enough rope and let him hang himself. So I couldn't have been nicer. I couldn't have been more patient with him. And he was rude from the start, asking us, why we're, what are you calling me for? Asking us questions, telling us.
He demanded a private plane. He'd be flown on private plane.
No, that's not correct.
No?
He has his own private plane and said we had to pay for his gas. That was the only way coming over here.
Thank you for the correction.
Yeah. So I knew that, and if you listen to the testimony, I started off with his beginning conversation. The first conversation he had was with my partner, was with Habib, and he was rude to Habib. Habib's the nice guy. Habib's the good cop. I'm the bad cop.
Wait, I just thought you just said you were the nice guy and that the jury will love you and see how nice you were. No? What do you mean by that? He's the nice guy and you're the bad cop.
So here's what I mean. I like to be nice. If I can, I want to be. That's more my personality, the way you heard me with Nick. But if it doesn't work, I'm quite willing to switch and become the aggressive bad guy. Habib is always the nice guy. So Habib ended up contacting him first, and he was rude on the phone. Habib is trying to ask a question, and all Doug Oliver will do is ask Habib questions. Well, who are you talking to? Well, what's your investigation? Habib's like, I can't. It wouldn't be proper. Well, then I'm not going to talk to you. Well, why? Is it a one-way street? Why am I going to give you information? Totally rude. So when I end up calling him back, he originally doesn't want to talk. He gives us a date to call him. He doesn't call. So I call him. He doesn't return it. When I eventually get a hold of him and I ask him, well, where were you? I was on a plane. Well, you picked the date. Why didn't you call? Hey, I was on a plane. What do you want me to do? It's expensive to call for a plane, okay? I don't like the way this conversation is going. Rude as can be. Now, I know that the jury is going to be hearing that. I also know that he comes off as the most privileged, I'm not going to say the word, but it might involve a donkey.
Okay.
And I know that his weakness is Bob Durst's weakness. They come off as privileged individuals who are above the law and can do whatever they want.
So you were so concerned about being located, Mr. Durst, that you didn't want to use your cell phone, period, anywhere in Galveston at all, correct?
Correct.
And you also paid cash for everything in Galveston instead of credit cards because you didn't want your credit card showing you were in Galveston. Is that correct?
Correct.
But Morris Black knew you were in Galveston, correct?
Correct.
He knew exactly where you were living, correct?
Correct.
And he knew that you were running away from the murder and reinvestigation of your wife, correct?
I don't have any idea if he knew anything about that. He never said anything to me about that.
All right, let's talk about the conversation you had with Susan Berman near the time of her death, where she told you that she had been contacted by New York investigators who wanted to talk to her about Kathy's disappearance. Do you recall that conversation with her?
I don't think she said New York investigators.
RD 176, 121310, page 666, line 12 to page 667, line 5. Let me correct, before you play, let me correct.
You heard from her?
Let me stop it for a second. I want to correct myself. I said New York investigators. I meant to say, yes, New York or Los Angeles investigators contacting you about Kathy's disappearance. Does that change your answer?
I'm not even sure she said investigators.
Okay, please play the clip.
She might have said detectives. She might have said reporters.
Okay.
She might have said investigators. She might have said New York or Los Angeles investigators. She said somebody wanted to talk to her.
All right, please play.
This is from People's 269, transcript 259A. This is page 90. But you heard from her that she had been contacted by the police?
Yes.
What did she say, if you remember?
He said the Los Angeles police contacted me. They want to talk to me about Susie Berman, I think I and you are gonna be best off if I just talk to them.
She said they want to talk to me about Susie Berman.
I'm sorry, Susie Berman said the police are in contact, the Los Angeles police have contacted me. They want to talk to me about her Jackie Durst disciplinary. And this was probably before the PR guy told me that the newspapers are doing these articles.
Now, at the time that Susan Berman told you that, you believed it to be true, correct?
I believed it was Susan telling me something. Never really. Everything Susan said was kind of a 50-50. It might be true, it might not be true.
Mr. Durst, isn't it true that you believed her when she told you that she had been contacted by the police who wanted to talk to her about Cassie's disappearance? Isn't it true that you believed it when she said that?
No, I just said everything Susan Berman said, you would kind of take with a grain of salt.
In fact, Mr. Durst, isn't it true that when I interviewed you on November 15, 2015, that I told you, hey, Bob, Susan lied to you, it wasn't true, and that your response was, I did not know that. Isn't that correct, Mr. Durst?
I don't remember, but that would be a right response. Because I never knew when she was lying and when she was not lying.
RD 519 31515, page 70, line 22 to page 71. I think it's line 9.
March 15th, 98, People's 291.
I would say I want this clip, and Ethan would pull it and have it ready, etc. So we had thousands of clips pulled on this case, and then I would make out my examination plan. Bob Durst's cross-examination plan was more than 200 pages. Susie Giordano's was, I think around 100 pages. And so I knew exactly where I was going to go. So one of the things with Susie Giordano was that I wanted to get Susie to say that the suitcase was empty when she got it. And at trial, she fell right into the trap and admitted that she got the suitcase and it was empty. Well, once she said that, and then I would say, and so you took that empty suitcase and she would say, yes, yes, yes. And I know that, the guillotine is coming, because obviously if the suitcase was empty when you started, how'd the money get there? So it was very clear that she was completely lying. She has gotten, the evidence shows that Bob gave her somewhere probably around $500,000. So all of the cutesy stuff she would do and the crying, etc. She's a pretty good actress.
I didn't think so at all. I thought she was a wreck on the stand.
No, this is what I mean.
Okay.
She was a wreck on the stand, but the poor little me, etc., that whole routine. Jean Clark, the other woman that, I don't know if you remember her.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Jean Clark was a tough lady, okay? She was also trying to get money for Bob. And Jean appeared a lot smarter than Susie, but if you look, Jean didn't get any money. Susie got $500,000. So, Susie was pretty good at playing different areas of manipulation.
And she'd do these Susie Giordano was in my memory, just doing these exasperated, every time she would get caught in a lie, she would kind of go, and look at the jury oh, can you believe what I have to put up with?
In talking to the jurors, there were so many witnesses that they hated. Emily Allman, Stuart Allman, Doug Oliver, Susie Giordano, Jean Clark, and Bob. Paul Kaufman.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about witnesses who, were up there lying for Bob